I'd like to go ahead and begin our applications panel by introducing the two panelists that we have here. And each of them will be giving about a 25-minute presentation of specifically their work or a piece of their work and how they've gone about trying to implement best practices for transparency and replication within their own respective field of work. And very brief introductions for both of them. So the first presenter will be James Morrison from the London School of Economics in the International Relations Department. I should add that James is an alumnus of the University of Chicago undergrad before going on to get his PhD at Stanford, where he was trained as a historian before becoming a political scientist. And then the other presenter is, of course, someone that you've already seen earlier today, Jenny Trinitopoli, Associate Professor of Sociology here at the University of Chicago, and also the director of the Center for International Social Science Research. And Jenny's presentation will be focusing on survey practices and best practices in her own work on survey methods. So without any further ado, James, please.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the warm introduction, and thank you again for having me. Thank you, Jenny, for having me, Nick, for all of your efforts, and I don't know if she can hear me, but Teresa out as well for making everything just flow so smoothly. I'm truly delighted and frankly honored to be back here at my dear alma mater presenting some of my research, and particularly the effort to make it more transparent and the challenges that I faced along the way. When I was an undergraduate here, we had an expression which certainly predated me and perhaps persists, that this is where fun comes to die. And that may or may not be true, but coming back here a couple times and thinking very fondly about my experiences here in those formative years where I really started these intellectual inquiries that I have yet to finish, I often think that it may or may not be where fun goes to die, but it's certainly where nerds go to heaven. And the fact that there are so many people on a beautiful autumn day, Friday afternoon, to hear us talk about research transparency really drives home that maybe that is indeed the correct perspective on this venerable institution. I'll be talking today about the dearly bought wisdom that comes with attempts to increase research transparency. I have two figures up here, Montague Norman on the right and Ernest Harvey on the left, and I'll tell you more about them in due course. But first, I just want to flag up my experience with the DART, the DART, the Data Access and Research Transparency Initiative. This is all based on an article I published in a national organization 2 years ago. That article was 15,000 words, which is over the journal limit. As it was a narrative, they gave me a little more space, a bigger canvas, thankfully. The DART component was an online appendix I wrote after it was accepted for publication, and that weighed in at 20,000 words. And one of the first questions I always get is, how much time did you waste doing this DART thing? And the answer is I kept track, and it took me just about 80 hours to construct this. Now, what does that mean? In the UK, we work in terms of hours and teaching loads and so on. This is about a third of the total amount of time, including prep and marking, that I do in any given academic year. So it's a serious amount of work to do this, and that is indeed why it was so dear, whatever wisdom I bought. Before I tell you about the specifics of my efforts in DART respects, I need to tell you just briefly about the project so you know who and what I'm talking about. The puzzle is really about Great Britain's abandonment of the international gold standard system in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Now, for centuries, Britain had been, as Keynes called it, the conductor of the international gold standard orchestra. It had been the very center of the gold standard, indeed the creator of the gold standard, and it had an unparalleled commitment to that standard. It was supported by a hegemonic ideology of classical liberal economics and Britain's most powerful mercantile and financial interests. Yet, on the 19th of September 1931, Britain, really not Britain, but the Bank of England, unilaterally walked off the gold standard, as Nixon would later do with the US in 1971. Now, this shocked the world because it was the center of the national financial system, but also it was the last place on earth that should have left the gold standard, since they had been such strong advocates of it. So it's a great puzzle, and it's one of the biggest puzzles in the field of international relations, international political economy. And there's no shortage of explanations for it, of course, since it is such an important and interesting puzzle. The traditional stories vary hugely, of course, in their points of emphasis, but I think they all broadly follow in what we in our field see as the Karl Polanyi tradition. Now, I know we have some sociologists, and you will rightfully object to the mangling that we have inflicted on poor dear Karl Polanyi, but nevertheless, this is the way that my field has used this framework, and there's a kind of synthesis that brings these things together. And it's really a story of two factors. The first is we have a disintegrating international system, and particularly Great Britain's declining position within that system, both raise the costs of maintaining the gold standard. We're going to need even more austerity than we expect. At the same time, politics within Britain are changing. We have new norms, new ideas, but we also have new institutions. Crucially, the expansion of the franchise to include lower class individuals in a socioeconomic terms, and vitally, the introduction of the women's suffrage. So all these things come together, and they reduce Britain's willingness to swallow the austerity at precisely the moment that more austerity is required. Now, this is a good synthesis, and it has largely stood the test of time, but it makes two critical assumptions. The first is that Britons at the time recognized that leaving the gold standard would alleviate unemployment, and second, that if they wanted to save the gold standard, they knew what to do to save it. It was obvious to them, and therefore, if they didn't save the gold standard, it's because they chose not to do so. Now, the research I've tried to do challenges both these assumptions, and yet to be seen whether I've been successful in that. Here's my story again in very brief overview. I look at both the left wing and the right wing to test these assumptions. The left wing politicians, I find, were fully committed to do whatever it takes to save the gold standard. Here's just one speech given by the Prime Minister to his Labour cabinet in the height of the crisis. If Britain left the gold standard, quote, the situation would rapidly worsen and unemployment would rapidly increase, far more rapidly than we have known it, even during this terrible time of depression. It's not that he didn't care about the working class. He was a socialist, the first socialist prime minister, and he was dedicated to trying to help the working class. But in his mind, leaving the gold standard would immediately bring uncontrollable inflation, which would be worse than the austerity required to save it. This is because everybody who, in his mind, had left the gold standard before had suffered the kind of hyperinflation that he and others explicitly described from Central Europe 1 decade earlier. Hyperinflation, I think many of you are aware. So the story is not about the left wing not doing what it took. They didn't know they could leave the gold standard, as one policymaker put it. The suspension really followed from the internal cleavages within the guardian of the gold standard, the Bank of England. And it wasn't about whether to save the gold standard whatsoever. The real debate was about how to save the gold standard. And this brings me to this cleavage within the bank between Ernest Harvey, who was the deputy governor of the Bank of England, and famous Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England. Now, this is a 15,000-word story that I go through in some detail. I won't bore you with all those details today, unless you ask during Q&A, which I hope you do. I'll just give you the very briefest of overviews. The basic position that Governor Norman has is that we need to use monetary policy, monetary austerity, raise those interest rates immediately. That will, of course, attract foreign capital, reduce inflationary pressures, and discipline the government into balancing the budget because, of course, the costs of borrowing will go up. That's a really reasonable thing to think. That's what he as governor has done several times in previous crises, and usually it works at high cost, but it works. The deputy governor, though, says this time is different because previously when we had these crises, we had conservatives in control. And now we have the socialists, and nobody trusts the socialists. And if we go to the heavy artillery of raising interest rates at the first sign of trouble, everybody's going to think that we, the bankers, have lost control of the government. And we have to instead make the government very publicly let blood. They need to go out there with a hair shirt, right? Imposing penance upon themselves, cutting unemployment relief to really demonstrate to capital markets that even they, the socialists in government, are serious about protecting the value of their capital. That's also a reasonable position. It's not a ridiculous thing to think. They had never really tested this kind of financial crisis with the Labor government before, and Harvey had lots of anecdotal evidence to present. So there's a clear division of ideas here. Ultimately, of course, Norman is the final word. He's the governor. And he starts implementing his policies. In the middle of the crisis in August, he has a nervous breakdown. He takes a leave from the Bank of England, which in fact frees up Harvey to reverse course, stop raising interest rates, and instead spend every day in Westminster badgering the Labor politicians to cut unemployment relief. Now this goes on for some time into September. Norman gets increasingly irate that Harvey's not following his instructions. He goes to America for reasons I'll explain shortly, and then decides to come back zealous that he was right, Harvey was wrong, and that we need to raise interest rates at the first possible moment. Now this causes trouble for Harvey, not just because he's worried that he'll get into trouble internally at the bank, but he thinks that that Norman will come back, inadvertently causing Labor to win the next election. And so for Harvey, it becomes a question of whether Labor is in control in conjunction with the Tories in a coalition government, or a radicalized electorate delivers a full mandate to Labor and goes off the gold standard in that context. Now, as I say, it's a complex story, and I'd be happy to explain more if there are questions. In short, for our purposes here today, the story is simple. There are pivotal, behind-the-scenes machinations that caused this radical policy shift. And of course, trying to show those behind-the-scene things is very difficult. It requires a lot of space, it requires a lot of discussion, exegesis, couching, and analysis. And so I'm going to take you now behind the scenes, both the things that people at the time didn't see and the things that my readers might not necessarily appreciate from just reading the article itself. So the question I think that I posed for myself and that Paul and I talked about in preparation for this is, what's the value added of DART, of research transparency? What would have remained non-transparent to my readers beyond what my readers would see on the page of this article? Now, one of the things I learned here at the University of Chicago studying history was that the documents don't speak for themselves. You have to interpret the documents. And indeed, silences are sometimes louder than words. The absence of a statement or the absence of a document is usually not important, but sometimes it's pivotal. So we always have these challenges. As anybody who does historical work, that data is missing. And this is not a qualitative or quantitative point. This is just a story about the difficulties of getting any kind of data. But in my case, I'm telling a story which is a kind of conspiracy theory. And that magnifies these challenges because it's not just that an archivist lost the data or somebody never recorded it, but my conjecture is that some of the actors themselves may have manipulated documents, may have destroyed documents, may have purposely not produced certain documents that are key to the story. So I'll tell you about 3 kinds of examples, and as I meant to do today, try to talk you through how I tried to help my readers understand the decisions I made as I came to construct this narrative. And I'm looking at, in this case, 3 specific gaps of the many different components of the story. The first one is about some missing telegrams. Okay? We have all these telegrams back and forth as Norman is in North America and between the Bank of England and the Bank of France, between the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Now, why are these telegrams missing? In order to understand this, we have to know something about the physical process of sending a telegram in 1931. And you can see here one of the images that I took from the archives, and you can see 2 different types of text on this telegram sheet, actually 3. You have the original pre-printed paper itself, and the basic process is you would go to your telegram office and you'd say, we're the Bank of England, we're going to send a lot of telegrams. And they would say, oh, we'd love to have your business. Here's a stack of pre-made telegrams. And the way that they were done then was with carbon paper. So you have a pre-printed sheet that you fill in, a piece of carbon, and then another pre-printed sheet. You would write your telegram or type it out, or the secretary would type it out, tear off the top, send it to the telegram office, keep the carbon copy in your own file. So in theory, there should be several copies of the telegram, one in the original bank collection, and then one on the receiving end as they get the transmission. The telegram offices didn't keep their copies. We should have at least 2. And you can see here at the bottom the pre-printed text. But notice at the very top, we have a second type of text. And this type of text is from the sequential numbering of the telegrams, which is different from the third type of text, which is the substance of the message itself, from a typewriter. Now, that second type of text is really interesting because it's all pre-printed numbered telegrams. And we have telegrams about telegrams saying, we got your 5734, did you get our 5521? And so on. But sometimes we don't have 5725. It's just missing. Why? Is it missing because somebody was simply typing the telegram, made a bunch of typos, or decided not to send it because it didn't matter, crumpled it up, threw it in the bin? That happens a lot, I'm sure. Or is it missing because somebody doesn't want that telegram to be found subsequently because they're perhaps going behind somebody's back? Harvey perhaps doesn't want Norman to come back and say, show me the telegrams you've sent. I'm now writing a book about some of these other moments in time, and I find this more and more and more. So I don't know why this gap is there. Is it meaningful or not? And it's very hard, of course, to communicate this with the limits of an article, a journal article, each time I talk about a telegram that's missing or not missing in the interpretation that I do. It just takes a lot of text to tell that story and explain all these details just for a couple missing telegrams. So, Dart granted me the space to explain the situation and to document my rationale for each of my non-obvious interpretations. I believe that these are robust interpretations, decisions I made. I did a lot of work to think about them, and I want interested readers to be able to consult that and then push me harder on whether I made the right decisions rather than just talking about the telegrams as if I didn't do all this thinking that figures into the story in a meaningful way. So that's the first gap. Here's the second gap. The New York Fed governor, George Harrison, no, not the George Harrison, the other George Harrison, my George Harrison, not your George Harrison. George L. Harrison, my parents are here, so I thought they would appreciate that. I'm from Wisconsin, so they came down for this, and Paul and Jenny were kind enough to have them. George Harrison, in the New York Fed, has a strong incentive to try to keep track of what's going on and to understand the inner workings of the Bank of England, because as we have the G7, G8, G20, whatever it is these days, it's important to try to coordinate macroeconomic policies. And so the central bankers have close working relationships, and they're trying to anticipate the actions of others, and so on. But he's in a different country, in a different time zone, and obviously unreliable because I find, and other scholars have found, lots of mistakes in his transcriptions of conversations and the inner workings. Sometimes he just makes mistakes. People make mistakes. So here's an instance of this. This is a set of notes he took after one of his conversations with Montague Norman, while Norman is in the middle of one of his nervous breakdowns in this crisis. Norman is talking to him about the cleavages within the bank, and Harrison writes down his reactions. The trouble is that we see, as you can, I hope, make clear in the image, the original typewriter typed Tuesday, July 29th, 1931, 12:40 p.m. The trouble is there's no such thing as Tuesday, July the 29th, 1931. Tuesday was the 28th of July. Wednesday was the 29th. Most of the time, this kind of thing doesn't matter at all. But in this case, it does, because there was a critical discussion between Harvey and Norman on the morning of Wednesday, the 29th of July. So is this a conversation about that critical disagreement? That'd be different than if it's a conversation before that critical disagreement, because that shows that the disagreement perhaps had played out over several days, rather than just in this one moment. Is it that Norman is venting directly after this critical disagreement in the bank, and then perhaps rethinks, oh, that wasn't a good idea? Or is it a long-standing disagreement, the crescendo of which we have not yet reached? So the dates matter. Now, somebody has corrected this, Wednesday, 29 July. They aligned it to be Wednesday, the 29th of July, thus after the critical disagreement we know about from other sources. Fantastic. But does that make sense? Is that the most likely scenario? Usually people know the day of the week more reliably than they know the numerical date. So if somebody makes a mistake and they type Tuesday, October 10th, we would think that if there isn't such a thing as Tuesday, October 10th, they probably got the Tuesday right, but not October 10th right. So I ask this question, and then I have to consult with these other documents in good Chicago history-style training. I then try to triangulate by looking at all those other things, and I ultimately come up that yes, it is Wednesday the 29th. They have reached the crescendo. This is Norman venting and so on. There's a lot of stuff here for a date for 3 words. Wednesday, 29 July. And it's several days of intellectual energy and going to the archives or consulting my archival documents and working at calendars. I don't need to put that in the article. People will trust that I haven't messed this up, one hopes. But boy, oh boy, the next scholar to work on this probably wants to know, when they ask themselves this question, why did I, the previous scholar, make this decision? DART gives me the chance to tell that story, to document this. I don't want the hours of thought that I put into something to be forgotten. And I know that because I rely so much on the fantastic footnotes left by historians of the past. And I'll come to that in a moment, how we're losing that art of explaining to subsequent readers and researchers why we make the decisions we make. Okay, the third and final gap that I explain, that I'll present to you here today. I told you about this trip in the middle of the financial crisis that brings Britain off the gold standard. Now, you won't believe this because it's truly wacky, but this guy, Montague Norman, is pictured here in the newspapers aboard the Duchess of York headed for North America, the 15th of August, 1931. In the middle of the crisis, what is the governor of the Bank of England doing, getting on a boat, going to America in the middle of the financial crisis that takes them off the gold standard they had since at least 1720? Maybe, I would argue, 1695. What's he doing? Well, the official story that he gives to the press, he was traveling incognito. The bank is questioned, they have a line, he has a line. New York is asked, the New York Fed has a line. He's just on a holiday. You don't understand. This is not an important crisis. It's totally handled. Oh, and everybody in the bank agrees, of course, and Norman's left written instructions for Mr. Harvey to solve the problem. You'll see nothing will happen here. Please move along. Well, that's the standard interpretation. And again, because I have this conspiracy theory, I believe that's not what happened, that we absolutely cannot trust the standard line that this guy leaving in the crisis is leaving because he wants to play a little golf here in late summer in Canada. My story is that he is going there to talk to New York Fed governor. He wanted to go to New York, and we find evidence that he asked if he could come to New York to talk to George Harrison. Why does he need to talk to George Harrison? Why doesn't he just pick up the telephone? The reason for that is simple. These are open lines. The technology at the time is switchboards. And believe you me, the telegram operators, the telephone operators are all listening to the conversations between central bank governors. You can hear them sometimes talking about, this is an open line, please be careful. And if there is, in fact, a deep cleavage in the Bank of England, if Montague Norman has, as we all know, suffered a nervous breakdown because of the disagreement that he's having with Ernest Harvey, Harvey is literally saying to Norman, you've lost your mind, you've lost the plot mate. And Norman is there, and he needs to talk to somebody to make sure that he's not wrong, that he is sane, and that Harvey's wrong. He can't get on the phone and say, well, you know, George, you wouldn't believe what Ernest Harvey said. He said I lost my mind. He said we should raise interest rates. I'm not sure. No, he said that we shouldn't raise interest rates. I think we should raise interest rates. That's exactly the kind of thing that everybody gambling in the market wants to know about. You can't have that conversation on the telephone. You have to get on a boat. You have to meet face to face. Knowing this, we see that Norman goes not to New York because that would arouse too much press attention, but in fact that he goes Canada. George Harrison comes up. He meets. We get another telephone call to Harvey. That's when we discover that Norman's on the first boat back to England. That's when Harvey gets spooked and says, I better go off the gold standard while we still have some conservatives in Parliament, because otherwise the election will come and Norman will screw it all up. So, again, that's a complicated story and there's a lot there, but you can imagine in analogous cases for the kind of work all of you do, sometimes you end up figuring these things out and you want to be able to explain why you come to these conclusions. And DART is a great opportunity to do that. It's a lot of work, but it's a great opportunity to explain why you come to the conclusions that you do. It's great, but it's really costly. 80 hours, 1/3 of a year's worth of teaching. It's like getting a 1/3 reduction in your teaching load for a year to not do this. Is it worth it? Well, I'll give a couple thoughts. And I'll mention that if you want a fuller account, you don't have to read the boring article. You can read the boring analysis of my experience with DART. Dearly Bought Wisdom, My Experience with DART, International History and Politics newsletter. So you can read several pages there that talks more about this. But for all of you here today, keeping an eye on the time, I'll just briefly summarize some of my conclusions about whether I think it's worth it. There are four things that tend to cause opaqueness, as I can imagine, broadly construed. The first is scholars' deliberate obfuscation. They're trying to get away with something. This does happen. We know this happens. But this is really salacious. And I think it was Jenny who mentioned last night at dinner that this is kind of a people are scared of plane crashes type phenomenon, even though they're really rare, that because they're spectacular, everybody focuses on those. So we focus on the fabulous who make things up. Well, DART doesn't begin to solve that problem, at least not in the kind of research that I do, because you could just as easily fabricate a bunch of documents and memoranda or interviews in far-flung archives. You don't have to just putting in a bunch of quotes and explaining your story doesn't solve the problem that maybe you, the researcher, made the whole story up. So I think that this is both a smaller problem than sometimes we appreciate, and I don't think that DART should be thought of as a way to solve that problem or address that problem. We have to address in other ways, like we talked about on the panels this morning. Incentives. Second, there are the inherent limitations of language. And if you do qualitative work, you quickly realize that space is your currency. You've got to have space to try to explain your interpretations, to pick apart the important meaning of words. That's what we do. We do other things, but we do that, I think, as a centerpiece of our research. DART gives us that liberation. It lets us have more space. We have material constraints. Nobody wants to print 20,000 words of discussion, basically extended footnotes. Why would they? That's a lot of trees to kill for a very small number, perhaps in many cases, including my own, 0 subsequent scholars caring about this exegesis. But digital is liberating. You put it on the web. I've got it on the IO website. I have it on my website as well, but it's there, it's frozen in time, and somebody who does research on this question can consult that and not waste their time doing the same thing that I've already done, and they can do better. They can figure out how to interpret things differently. We also have then the norms that shape knowledge production, transmission, and consumption. And this is a slight pet peeve of mine, but in our field of political science, we increasingly have parenthetical citations, which I think constrain scholarship. I think they personally, aesthetically look hideous, and frankly, they crush my soul. And they crush my soul for the very best reason, which is, of course, as Patrick Henry didn't quite say, but should have said, give me Chicago style or give me death. I like Chicago style, I like discursive notes. So I want to emphasize that insofar as I conceive of this, the objective with DART should not be, and I don't think has been, to try to help qualitative work match quantitative work in the science race. I don't think that that's what we're up to here. The objective is to try to share the wisdom that's acquired by scholars doing this kind of work. And if you're doing quantitative work and you're building a data set, you make all kinds of interpretive decisions. There was a famine that year. We then tried to moderate the data that we got because of the famine on human height averages. There's a huge amount of interpretation that goes into building and interpreting any data set, qualitative or quantitative. Why not share that so that other people can better understand the materials you've used and use them better? The increased transparency increases, I think, the quality of our knowledge. And crucially, it saves us from insight decay. My heart is broken sometimes when I read these masterful historical texts from people who have died. And I can't go and ask them or email them, why did you interpret this way? I trust them. I get that they probably did it right. I see so often that I, after days of work, come to the same conclusion they did. But if they had the opportunity to have posted online why they did that, it would be such a boon. It would save me time. And if I do this now, I will hopefully save subsequent scholars time. So that's the objective. The method is not simply to upload a bunch of stuff to the cloud. I think that's lazy, and I don't think that's helpful. The method is to explain the provenance, where things come from, how they got from where they were created into your hands, who touched them along the way. The transcription, or translation, or the input of the data, and the interpretation of the data. And this is quantitative and qualitative alike. And I just don't think these differences are all that great. Good research is research that is transparent. Useful research is research that is transparent. So the wisdom that comes with all this is indeed dearly bought. But I guess I don't understand why we could see something that would improve the quality of our research, albeit at high cost, but make it better, and why we wouldn't try to do that. Why we wouldn't say, yes, that is better if we recognize it as better. Of course, I do political economy. I recognize that we have material constraints. But why not produce the best research we can? And the thing I often say is, I don't think there are a lot of scholars who run around and say, boy, I wish there were a lot more lower quality research in my field that I had to read. Wouldn't we all be happier to have a smaller number of higher quality, more transparent publications? Wouldn't that be a better thing for us as consumers as well as for producers? And I'll leave that there. Thank you all very much for your attention, and we'll have Jen.
All right, well, we've talked a lot today about transparency and replication standards from the standpoint of data that already exist, and a lot less about research design. And my view on the second part of the topic comes out of about a decade of field work, specifically survey research, in-depth interviews, and quasi-ethnographic styles of data collection that have taken place in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily in Malawi, which has been my primary research site. Now, the work that I'm going to present is going to tell us something about what I think are the costs, consequences, and opportunities of confronting a reality which I think many people will agree with here, which is that data collection in and of itself can be disruptive. And if we're altering the social world simply by studying it, what exactly do we know at the end of the day, and how far are we willing to take that, right? How far must we take that? And this project is really being advanced in collaboration with two other people. One is Sarah Yateman, my collaborator and good friend from graduate school, who has been part of the Segolo Latanzi project since we designed it together back in 2008. Segolo Latanzi means healthy futures in Chichewa. And the second person is Joanna Oh, a graduate student here at the University of Chicago, who is the person who is responsible for the fact that this is not sitting in my file drawer on a list of things to pick up when I have the time. And who is also, because she was not part of the original data collection project, has a unique capacity to remind me where my PI and sort of insider blinders are, and to try to take those away as we advance a look at what research does to respondents and how it alters our knowledge. The project Segolo Latanzi is set in a rural town in southern Malawi, where HIV prevalence stands at about 15% of adults. The country is very, very poor, and fertility is very, very high. These are sort of the key demographic facts about this part of the world. And because young adulthood unfolds in a very quick way, we designed a study that we intended to help us understand how young adults navigate childbearing and the risks of HIV simultaneously while they're trying to start their families and also trying to avoid a deadly disease that is invisible to many people in the community. And in order to do this, we started with a cohort of young women. They were between the ages of 15 and 25 in 2009 when we started data collection. And we had this intensive longitudinal design where we really needed to interview them several times a year because life changes super quickly in this part of the world, right? A woman might be in school, never had a boyfriend before, hasn't really thought about any of these risks at age 15. When we re-interview her at age 18, right, in a typical panel design from the demographic tradition, we learned that she is divorced, she has one child, she's infected with HIV, not in school anymore, and untangling the causal, untangling the causation there is very, very complicated. So we designed this study to focus on a particular stage of the life course where young people, women in particular, were very vulnerable. So we knew we had to study them by enrolling them and following them at these pretty close intervals. And because of confidentiality concerns, the work couldn't really reasonably be done with home-based interviews. We conducted our interviews in a research center that had private rooms where we could conduct HIV testing, have privacy around sensitive issues, and make sure that we didn't have variation in the level of privacy that our respondents and the conditions of the interview. So this was a pretty massive study. We started by enrolling about 1,500 women, which is about a 1 in 4 sampling ratio for this age group. And once they were in the study, the respondents kept coming back to the research center on a regular basis to tell us really about how their lives had changed and to allow us to construct pretty detailed histories about transformations during young adulthood. This is our research team. We had a staff of about 60 people in this study, including supervisors, the enumerators, and the interviewers themselves, data entry clerks, a gardener to keep the space looking nice and pleasant so people would want to come there, watchmen, which was part of our data security protocols, cleaners, and of course a granny, which you really need on staff for a fertility project to help us wrangle all the babies and toddlers that were coming in and out of the research center on a daily basis. So this project was leaving a really large footprint in a community of about 50,000 people. The first thing that we wrote from this project really helped us emphasize the importance of subjective understandings of AIDS and really try to move away from just the clinical literature, which was interested in whether HIV positive women had different patterns of childbearing than women who weren't infected. And we really sort of shifted to think about the ways in which subjective experience and senses of risk and uncertainty around HIV were informing fertility patterns. Other things we were able to learn because we had such detailed data on these causal connections were things like women who became infected with HIV during the study had almost all been to a health clinic in the weeks or month preceding our ability to diagnose them, and they hadn't been diagnosed in the clinic. They had gone there thinking that they maybe had malaria, weren't feeling quite right, had a little bit of a fever, but HIV had never come up, right? It was, and so we've been able to make a set of recommendations about the importance of introducing new algorithms for early detection in clinics, specifically where people are seeking treatment for malaria, because it's sort of opportunity to treat early and prevent disease. I had graduate students contributing great new ideas that I never thought of, including one former student who collected direct literacy and numeracy assessments with our respondents to find out what kind of good is education if you're not learning to read, or if you're not learning what to do with numbers along the way, and really trying to disentangle education as an institution from skills themselves in the way that this relates to health. So all of this and about 24 other papers, of which I'm very, very proud to come out of this research, is based on what took place inside the research center. This place with small private rooms where we could learn a lot about people's private lives in an uninterrupted and very private setting. But as a culturally attuned and attentive, I think, researcher, there are a lot of other things that we learned along the way about our respondents' lives and how they were changing. And I want to offer 2 anecdotes that made me think that we needed to dig into thinking about the effects of research on respondents in a more serious way. Here in the flowered dress is an interviewer who is a very close friend of mine named Ivy. And behind her is a respondent coming in for a subsequent visit, very proud of the new sweater she bought with the small incentive she received after her last interview, right? Another interesting thing to come out of the conversation as it evolved between Ivy and a respondent, this is a little synthesized story to protect identities, was in learning about the way this respondent's lives had changed since her last interview. Among the various things we tracked were people's their sexual behavior and their methods of contraception. One respondent disclosed to Ivy that she had, since her last interview, had found the courage to go to the Banja, which is a clinic, which is the Marie Stopes Clinic, responsible for most of the access to family planning in Malawi and also across sub-Saharan Africa, and talk to them to get the injectable shots, because she realized when she was talking about her relationship with her boyfriend and the fact that she really did want to stay in school, that she probably would end up pregnant if she didn't do anything about it. And she'd been very afraid to go to the Banja people, but since the Sagola Tanzi people were nice to her and she could handle her interview, she figured she could handle them at the clinic too. And so she wanted to update her contraceptive use. And again, in the confines of this very nice and the private setting of the interview. A second story I'll relay came from some of our recruitment and retention techniques throughout the study. Here's an interviewer taking a bicycle taxi out to visit some of our respondents who weren't able to come in for their interviews because they were immediately postpartum. And traditionally, women stay home for about 60 days after having a baby and don't really travel to other places. And so rather than asking them to come to the clinics in order to get just very basic information about the health of the mother and the health of the baby immediately postpartum, we did some home visits. And this interview got on a bicycle taxi to travel out to do some of her visits in the more remote villages. And her bicycle taxi driver said to her, you know, you're one of the Sagola Tanzi people. I have a Sagola Tanzi girlfriend. And she said, really? That's so interesting. He said, yeah, it's a very funny story. This woman on the bicycle is a very good interviewer. She said, we have time. This is a long ride. I would really love to hear your story. So he told her about the fact that his girlfriend had been randomly sampled, randomly selected to participate in the study with the people who had the new building. And she went to the study and talked to some people. She thought they treated her very nicely. She gave her a Fanta. They gave her a Fanta. And they were talking about the interview after, and he asked her, well, what did you tell them about me? And she said, well, I didn't tell them about you. And he said, well, what do you mean you didn't tell them about me? I'm your relationship. I'm your boyfriend. And she said, well, you know, I've never met your parents. I've never met any of your friends. You seem like a good guy, but I don't know how serious you really are. And he said, well, you know, I'm really serious about you. If you didn't tell the Sagola Tanzi people about me, then perhaps you're the one who's not serious. What's going on here? So they decide in this conversation, this post-interview conversation about the disclosure to the TLT people, their relationship, that it is indeed a real relationship. They are serious about each other. They would like to meet each other's parents. They would like to meet each other's friends, and they think that they should be on the record in a survey as well. And so you collect these kind of anecdotes and amass them in a variety of different perspectives and think, how much is changing in people's lives that we're observing, no matter how specific we are in the sort of detailed of the timing of these events, how much is changing specifically because we are observing them and because we are inflicting in a bunch of very particular kinds of conversations on our respondents. And we have a lot of scientific foundations for worrying about this, right? From a variety of different disciplines and a variety of different traditions. So I want to talk about my decision to explore this systematically, right? In the field, the first thing I did after hearing a couple of these stories was ask my interviewers to start keeping diaries, start keeping detailed notes when things like this came up, so that we would have a record of it and be able to think clearly about it as the study evolved. The second thing that we did was introduce something that I think is more portable and I think might give us something productive to think about, specifically in longitudinal survey research. And that is the refresher sample as comparison method. We started at the beginning of the study by doing a complete census of the area, and that was what we needed to do to draw our sample because there was no sort of good phone book, as you can imagine, for a rural area like this. We interviewed our respondents 8 times over the period of a couple of years. And there was a lot of stability, as you expect, thank you, as a demographer, in many of the things that we were looking at. We had a stable number of new HIV infections each a more or less stable number of HIV infections each wave. We were seeing about 70 births in each wave, between 50 and 60 marriages, 25 to 30 divorces. And so we had a sense of the patterns that were developing. By conducting a 9th wave of the survey, we would have completed our original plan, but we probably wouldn't have learned very much that was completely new. And this issue of the question of the way that our research might be influencing our respondents was really, really bugging me. So we decided to do something which I'll call this refresher sample as conditioning. I'm going to boil it down to you as a recipe. And my goal is to be a little bit more specific than the recipe my grandmother, though I really, really love that woman, gave me for making a big plate of ravioli. This is how you make ravioli. I'd like to be a little more specific than the instructions I got for her, or for the famous how to draw an owl meme, right? But I'm going to do it in 6 easy steps, right? The first is that I think we should worry about study effects, and I think that it should keep us up, and I think it should be something that we don't fuss about in a sort of self-sabotaging way, but in a way that that motivates us to do more from a real concern with knowledge. The second, whatever your topic is, mine, sort of young adult development, sexual and reproductive health, risk of HIV in sub-Saharan Africa. I think we need to actively generate hypotheses about where we think survey effects should be expected and where they shouldn't, right? Where we shouldn't find them. I think we need to think both about processes such as conversations with a partner that would be more detailed than the ones you were having before, or and about outcomes such as number of children ever born, if that's the thing that you're interested in. And I think that the brainstorming from this needs to come from the literature, and I think it's especially helpful to have an ethnographic or quasi-ethnographic record that you're consulting simultaneously, such as the notes that I had from my interviewers and were able to go on. One example from mine is looking for differences in socioeconomic status. One of my respondents bought a new sweater, right? We were giving our respondents small amounts of money throughout the study. Of course, we should see some difference between people who were getting some money, even small amounts, and people who weren't. And this was an example of the set of hypotheses we generated to be looking across for differences in these 2 populations across a variety of domains. The third is where, the rubber hits the road, so to speak. The third step is to go back to your original sampling frame and draw a could have been sample. I would suggest that you call it a refresher sample and motivate this by attrition concerns, both when you're speaking to your program officer and to your collaborators. So it does not appear that you're looking just to commit self-sabotage by figuring out what exactly has what exactly you've done wrong, or how exactly you've changed the situation along the way. And the fourth step is to find those respondents and interview them. This is really, really, really difficult, and finding people right after you've listed them is not so difficult, right? We had in my study 97% response rate when we went looking for respondents a week after we had listed all the households. When we went back 3 years later, the story was quite different. We were able to recruit about 57% of them. We have very differential response rates, but you need to assess whether these whether these respondents are reasonably comparable on baseline basics, simple sociodemographic factors, and what kinds of corrections can be made statistically, and whether you can sort of proceed at all in these ways. In our situation here, this is a really sort of basic set of comparison between our core or our original sample of women and the ones that we enrolled at wave 9 of the study in order to see whether the study itself had been a treatment. And we see, wow, there's pretty comparable in terms of age, in terms of household size, in terms of many of the things that we care about, some differences by ethnicity, light difference in socioeconomic status, things that we need to pay attention to as we sort of proceed. The final step here is to compare the original sample and your refresher sample on the outcomes of interest, right? On the ones that you've hypothesized and the ones that you've thought through, and hope for the best, right? And I will say, in the interest of transparency, this is one of the most terrifying things I had ever done. But there are, in addition to talking about sort of the costs, right? And because we were funded, there was a major policy change after we finished the waves 8 and 9 of the first phase of the study. There was a major policy change, and we were able to go back into the community in 2015 and re-interview everyone. So comparison and refresher sample women, so we could see whether the treatment of being in the study, or we could get some sense of whether the treatment of being in the study had durable effects, right, longer term effects, or just short effects, right, if any, that were there at the end of the study, of the first phase. Given our study's emphasis on relationships and childbearing and the things that people want for their lives. Remember, we're talking about adolescents and young adults in this study. They were 15 to 25 when we first started. And going back to this question of the process, what's the way in which having ongoing conversations with a new person about very intimate aspects of your life, what's the way in that might affect you? Well, from a very, very, very simple measure, how often do you think about your future, right? We found differences between our original sample and the new women, the refresher sample, in that our original sample told us that they were thinking more about, they were more likely to say that they were thinking a lot about the future. And the pattern of this is quite interesting. This is just a very, very sort of crude description of how this changes over time. It does not look linear. There's nothing that sort of looks to me like a dose response. But when women started this study, about 40% of them told us that they were thinking very often about their future, right? After we had asked them a lot of questions about their future, that went up, right? My colleague John Levy-Martin calls this, are you thinking about an elephant problem? Are you thinking about an elephant? Well, I wasn't, but now I'm thinking about an elephant, right? So what we found was that our comparison sample women, when we enrolled them in the study, that's the light line there in 2012, looked a lot like the women that the prevalence of thinking a lot about the future from where we started. When we stopped talking on a regular basis to our core sample respondents about the future and prompting them to think about it, and we visited them again in 2015, that number, the proportion who were thinking a lot about their future, dropped down to levels that, you know, look pretty original levels to me. And I have no explanation for the fact that these refresher sample women would be thinking less about the future than they were in the first place, but it's an interesting thing to note. With respect to the big things that we were interested in, I found a lot to be excited about and relieved by. We found no major differences in ideal family size, one of the more important contributors, or one of the more important indicators of fertility and future fertility in developing countries. We did not find major differences in HIV prevalence between these two groups. The study did not change the world or change the community or flip things upside down. But we did find, for example, that women who had been part of the study had much more agenic attitudes about childbearing and HIV. They were less likely to agree with statements like, children just happen, children are from God, right? HIV is God's lottery, we can't prevent it. Or HIV prevention is really, really, really hard. People who had been in the study and had been talking about these issues on an ongoing basis said, no, that's not true. We decide when to have children. And it's not up to God. We can protect ourselves. There were also some differences that we found in terms of marriage patterns, and these were a little bit more complicated and specific to the study. So I'm going to skip over those and really just get to the overall interpretations of what this exercise is good for beyond the very, very specifics of my case. The interpretation, my interpretation of this is that in the setting of Balaka, the questions we asked and being in this setting influenced respondents' thoughts and behaviors in ways that we should care about, right? Asking young people questions about their futures, it requires them to imagine those futures in specific ways that might not always get prompted from everyday conversations and through the normal rhythms of their daily life. It may, for example, prompt a woman to go and get a new kind of contraception, to have a particular kind of conversation with a romantic partner. Assessing all of them in our study as a whole, the unintended consequences of research here are overwhelmingly positive. If you're interested in managing fertility, contraceptive use, and longer birth intervals, indicators like that are good things. However, we have to keep asking ourselves the question of what we're actually studying. I think it's very, very helpful to know, for example, that longer birth intervals are observed among our study respondents than among people who weren't in the study, not because of that specific finding, but it gives us some hints about direction in the estimates that we're generating, right? If we think that the average birth interval is around 3 years or 36 months, we know that our guess is probably a little high, right, for what's being observed in the rest of the country. So it gives us a little bit of cautions, and it tells us about the ways in which we can and should be more humble in our conclusions. I think there are implications for researchers in this, and I'd like to talk about the costs, which, are an extra survey round. A lot of documentation, and frankly, a lot of uncertainty and some, as I said earlier, terror around the possibility of possibly having to walk back some of your research findings if you find out that you've really changed things that matter in people's lives by studying them. I think the consequences of this, but on the other hand, as far as the costs go, if you're if you're fielding a pretty expensive study and you've collected 8 waves of data already, that 9th isn't that much harder, except for the recruitment. And I think in that sense, it's sort of it's well worth it. The consequences, I think, are real for transparency's sake and for being a little bit more open about what's under the hood in terms of data collection and in terms of things that happen during the fieldwork process, which is something that I wish survey researchers made the habit of writing more and more about. But finally, I would like to say that I think that this kind of approach, if it were to become more commonplace or even perhaps standard and expected in longitudinal studies of human beings, is an opportunity for a couple of reasons. The first is that it has the potential to generate a lot of new knowledge about the specific places and about the role of research. It can also help point us to potentially important interventions, right, in thinking about development, in my case, and HIV prevention. Really the importance of conversation and clear conversation about these things for the future seemed very important to our respondents. And I don't think that that is going to replace comprehensive HIV prevention programs, but I do think that we spend huge amounts of money on lots of interventions for which there are no foundations to support, that there's no empirical foundation to support. So if we know that ongoing conversations about reproductive goals is good for reproductive health and decision-making, that might give us new ideas about how to design better interventions. I'd like to close with a remark that it is not all done, but I am doing my best to share this data to make it transparent, and I'm doing that with the help from archivists at ICPSR through their program on data sharing for demographic research. So the questionnaires, instruments, publications, and a set of documentation guides are available through the project website, and there is data, the waves are coming, the waves of data are coming online very, very slowly, but with excellent documentation. So with that, thank you.
Before I begin, I will just briefly say that what Colin was going to talk about very much would have dovetailed nicely both of these. So Colin does a lot of ethnographic work. And one of the frustrations, and this will lead into one of the questions I have for both of you, but he talked about the work that he's been involved with is he's very much frustrated by, he said, for example, he wanted to do a study about the experiences of certain people dealing with, for example, he's environmental studies, and I think it was dealing with like fracking and so forth. And he wanted to study how these communities, but he said because of the standards for ethnographic work, he had no way of knowing what community this was. So he couldn't replicate a study. He couldn't go and see, I want to go see how this is done, because he's like, I have no idea where this study was done. That's how well it was made anonymous. And so he's been on the leading edge of trying to come up with ways of making ethnographic work less anonymous, but still being able to satisfy the costs that would be associated with what an IRB board would be thinking through and so forth. And so really trying to do things so that future researchers can actually go about and conduct a new study on that venue in that community, what have you. And so that's a big part of what he was doing. That's what he would have talked about today. And I think that would have dovetailed very nicely with the two presentations we did have. Having said that, because he wasn't here, it allowed both of you to go a little bit more in depth with your studies. And I think that was very beneficial for everybody here. And there's a lot that I could ask about. There was a lot of great things, but I think one thing that really stood out to me with both studies was the idea of researcher effects, which was, of course, very explicit in Jenny's presentation, or expected researcher effects, which is what I'm thinking about with your study, right? That this is something, I mean, policy officials are not unaware that there's archives being kept. And they're going to say, gee, how am I going to look in the future? Right? And so I'm going to anticipate that people are going to be reading this. Sometimes it might be very direct. People who might be voters, like you said, with the open line, I don't want this to get out there. But it's been shown many times that policymakers are very much aware that there's archives being kept. I want to look good in the future. So I'm going to make sure that this memo is written a certain way and so forth. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what is it that we can do to ensure that we're, avoiding both, I mean, and again, this would be a little bit more elaboration on what you talked about, Jenny, but both researcher effects, but also how to manage anticipated researcher effects, right? So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on those ideas.
The first question's for you, so I get to think.
And really, they both could be, because I'm sure you could have anticipated researcher effects, such as like social desirability type of answers and so forth too.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the most responsible way for me to proceed, given what I know about survey data collection in this part of the world, right, is to sort of be done with the if research effects question and to say, what are they? How big are they? How do they matter, right? To really be sort of done with, I wonder if we have these or not, right? To me, it seems so clear that this happens, and not just in developing context when where people may not, especially women, may not be asked their opinion very frequently, right? And in places like that, we might expect researcher effects to be larger, right? Because the intervention or the act of research is stranger, right, compared to their daily lives. But even, polls done not so well in the United States have, they generate conversation in people's homes, in people's minds, and those conversations lead to different kinds of conclusions, sometimes not any kinds of conclusions, but they still are sort of part of the process, right? And so if we're trying to understand, and we know this from literature on priming, we know this from, these are not my ideas, right? But we sort of often proceed as if we're only concerned with things like sampling error and I think there are lots of other kinds of error that we would do well to think more carefully about than simply specification problems. And I think that getting into those the specifics, I mean, interviewer effects is another area of research that I think is very, very important to think about in how we generate knowledge and in terms of research transparency. So I think that we would do well to spend more time on that and to value it, right? Not as footnotes, not as a set of robustness checks, but as actual contributions.
Absolutely. James, did you want?
Yeah, so on this point, I had the great delight and advantage that we talked about this last night at dinner, and I had never thought about this before because I don't really know anything about sociology or psychology, but when you started talking about how just asking these women these questions has itself an effect, we talked about how that's sort of, well, at least that's what TV says is what psychotherapy is about. Just somebody asking you questions leads people to start to see the world in different ways and ask themselves questions and so on. So I just think it's really interesting that it can be as subtle as asking the question, are you thinking of an elephant, right? It's really incredible. Fortunately, I don't face that because as of now, not everybody who does the kind of things I do only work on dead people. Sometimes people do interviews, of course, but I only work on dead people. And so the great advantage and disadvantage is that when journal editors or IR human subjects type people come around and start telling me and my colleagues about this is how you have to do things when you study people, I just get to tune out and maybe reply to some email because I haven't yet done any seances to try to talk to Montague Norman about what he was thinking. I'm not worried about Montague Norman. But Paul's question, so that's a great advantage. Paul's question, though, is really hard for me because I just don't know how to think about the fact that Winston Churchill, someone who I'm writing in one of my books now, is the guy who brought Britain onto the gold standard after the First World War, back onto the gold standard. Winston Churchill knew every word he wrote was going to be carefully studied by subsequent historians because, of course, he did that to his ancestors, and he knew that he was a historic figure. That was his dream. So 100% of what Winston Churchill said in death had to, of course, be viewed through the lens that he knew that we were watching him. He didn't know us. We didn't have a personal relationship with him the way that you and your researchers have with these women. But he is trying to look at us, and he's trying to understand, and we're trying to look at him and trying to understand. So sometimes it's a huge problem, and I think we just cannot get around it in any reasonable way. We just have to try to triangulate and get multiple stories the same way we do in a legal case where we have a witness who has an incentive to tell a story one way or the other. But sometimes we find more minor figures who aren't aware that, or aren't conscious in the way that, say, Winston Churchill was, that what they were going to be saying and reporting on was going to be scrutinized by subsequent historians. And so it might well be more effective. Nevertheless, it is a great question, and we have to recognize that a lot of what we see is not objective, but it's just perception, other people's perceptions of situations, and they know that we're watching sometimes.
Well, those are great answers, and again, these kind of researcher effects are just something that make it all the more important why our data is made transparent and so forth in either of the two ways that you presented to us, because it helps us to think about if we can see the survey instrument, or we can think about the history of that document and the numbers. It allows us to be more attuned to those things, which then in turn feeds into this idea of the context of the study. That it's like, maybe sometimes a study fails to replicate because the researcher effects are either heightened or lower, that it has nothing to do with the theory, has nothing to do with the method. It could actually have to do with the way it's conducted. So very interesting ideas to really grapple with.
This is your comment related to the poisoning of the well there, or Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. As a former physics student, I love telling my students that it's like the uncertainty principle, just like you have to measure position of something, you have to bounce a photon off of it, similarly asking a question. And then my physics friends like hate when I use that because they say, no, the uncertainty principle isn't that. But now I'm a social scientist, so I like that. Anyway, I just want to emphasize, I guess, this is something I didn't really say earlier, but there's no home base. So I think we're trained to think there's the home base. You work hard, you play by the rules, and you live a happy middle-class lifestyle as a scientist. And just like it doesn't exist in the economy, it doesn't exist in science anymore. And so you think, I did a random sample survey or a random experiment, and I followed all the rules, and I got the statistical significance, so now I'm right. And then it turns out, no, this happens all the time, and people are just playing with noise. And it's kind of annoying to them because they played by the rules, and the rules were wrong. There is no home base, which can be very liberating. I think it shouldn't be scary, it should be liberating. I think for all the reasons that the panel discussed, that people shouldn't feel bad about speculating. But I think this is also true with the poisoning of the well, and I speak of that as someone who works in survey research. Once you accept that every question is going to influence what people are going to say, you realize they're being influenced already. So they're already having social media at them all over the place. So that just means you have to measure the effect of things not in the vacuum, but in the atmosphere. And that's just the way it is, but that also means that various designs that seem pristine weren't pristine either, and we have to accept that.
Do you want to respond to that, or?
I agree. I have nothing intelligent to say beyond that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your last comment that not in the vacuum but in the atmosphere also gives another set of questions, which I'm going to get to writing about. I'm going to chip away at these like one at a time. But the effects, the spillover effects for people in the community who are not in the research study, right? For example, the sisters of respondents who are also exposed to the conversations that are generated by this, at least in some degree, and sometimes exposed to the incentives that they got if the respondent decided to share with her family. And there are lots of ways, and I mean, dissemination of research findings to community members, especially when you're working with in developing settings, is not like something that I do because I think it's a responsible thing to do as a researcher. Yes, I do, but it's also required as part of your survey protocol, right? You need to be in touch with district health officers. You need to be telling people in the community what you're finding in the research. That's the only way that you're allowed to proceed given the sort of questions that we're talking about. And we held in my study regular open types of forums occasionally, not regularly, but maybe twice a year throughout the study. And a lot of times religious leaders, village chiefs would gather and come to these, and we would just sort of talk about the basics of what was going on at the research center, make sure that people didn't have concerns about it. And in one of these, when we were giving them the updates, we were letting them know about HIV prevalence, a huge argument erupted between the men at the meeting and the women in the meeting, because HIV prevalence among women at this stage of the life course is about 3 times as high as it is among men. Now, men get HIV at the same levels, they just get that later on in life. And the women stood up, formed a group, screamed, and they said, "We've been telling you for years that you're killing us. Will you listen to these people? You haven't been listening to us." So we have these other sort of spillover effects into the community, which are also altering lots and sorts of things, but that's also life, whether it's coming from social media, whether it's coming from new government campaigns, whether it's coming from our research thing. And that's one of the things I really loved. I underlined it 3 times of Andrew's comment earlier this morning that, like life is with in-person design. There's lots of, and you believe that more and more. And I don't think that makes us think that there's less to do, right? Or we're not still doing research according to the best practices we have and the standards that we know about. But I think there's a humility that comes with that, specifically with some of the conclusions that we draw from what we're learning.
I keep using letting you talk for a bit so I have a chance to collect my thoughts. And then so I will just briefly say it would be debilitating to say let's not study things if we can't study them without affecting them, because we all agree that we affect the things we study, even if those things we're studying have long since passed. The fact that it was known we would study them affected those things. It would just be debilitating. But the idea behind, one of the ideas behind transparency is to try to document how we navigated that so that other research, this was commented on this morning, it's fun and exciting when you're a new researcher and you say, that's how they did that. Maybe I'm going to try to do a similar thing a little differently. And if we tell people how we did it instead of black boxing it, I think it opens up more channels and we can, again, triangulate a bit.
Let's take another question from the audience. It's right here in the front, Nick.
This is more a follow-up to Andrew's question. I think I worried a lot about this when I was first starting doing interviews with people. I was afraid I might subtly cue them to certain things. And I was talking about this one night at dinner with my husband, and one of my teenage sons kind of came out of the fog that he was in and said to me, aren't these people you're interviewing people who stared down the Gestapo? And I said, yes, in many cases. And he looked at me and shook his head and said, you're not that scary, Mom. So sometimes I think we worry too much about some of these. I was thinking about your comment in particular about the, you said that you found that the people were thinking a lot about the future, and then there was a 3-year gap, I think, and you went back and they weren't. And I wonder sometimes if part of that might be they already thought about it. And it's like you were there and you kind of introduced the concepts like, yeah, okay, I went through that, and then it's been asked and answered. You know, I've done all that. So I wonder if that was part of it. The question I had for you was, you said several times in your talk that DART made it possible for you to do this. But I think you could have done this without DART, couldn't you? I mean, you're really talking about the fact that we have blogs, we have a lot more digital work now. So I think some of these issues are things that are simply happening because of the age that we live in, that there's much more technological sophistication that people can have, so, which is good. But I really recommend you doing this. I think I commend you for that. You should be proud of your son, wherever these parents are. But did a good job. It takes a lot of time to do this. It does.
Did either of you want to offer a response?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's also important as we sort of dive into these questions of research effects not to overestimate our own importance, right? And so I take that as a humbling reminder, because I agree with that completely.
So that's a great question. Of course we can do these things, and I'll say a little bit more in this International History and Politics newsletter piece that I wrote, that we need to incentivize this. We need to give people due credit for doing this kind of thing. And so it's the recognizing it, which I don't think I've been recognized. It's not like my head of department is delighted with me having spent all this time on this. He's a great guy, so I think he values it, but it's not going to weigh in my file, maybe much at all. Maybe it will, but I think if we could incentivize it, and again, not necessarily negatively, but trying to reward this in the way that somebody who creates a data set is rewarded in various ways. It's a contribution to share this knowledge. It's a different type of knowledge. It has a different payout. But giving people some reward for doing this kind of thing, maybe DART is a little too penal as currently conceived by some, but giving people a positive reward gives them the intellectual, professional, let's say, professional space to do it. But you're right, we could and should do it even without the incentives, because I think it's the right thing to do.
First, just an observation that it's really good to remember archives have personalities. They should really be treated as key informants, not as buckets of documents. But I had two questions that go to thinking about this in terms of publications. One is your longing for Chicago-style citations. And could you sort of really think about, given that, you know, publication is not physical anymore, we really could do anything we wanted anywhere. What is the sort of distinctive difference between doing the DART and reverting to old style footnotes, sort of what specifically is there. And then you did this after the article had been accepted for publication, and what would have been different if this had been sort of an expectation that it would go through the publication review process?
Yeah, those are good and tough questions. In terms of what would be different, I'm obviously being a little bit cheeky in talking about Chicago-style footnotes just because that's what I like and I prefer that aesthetically. Functionally, the difference between the kind of dart stroke active citation thing that I did is that the idea is to try to reproduce the relevant quotes where possible, to contextualize them, to give the relevant exegesis and this kind of thing. And even the best law review journals that are famous for their extensive footnotes, right, exactly, don't do this kind of thing where they say every time you quote something, try to give us the context, the different context, right, the textual context, the provenance, the archive. I mean, just couldn't agree more that we have to think about archives as another kind of source of information the same way that an interview is a source of information. It has a personality, it has a disposition, it has a bias. And by archives, I don't mean big white marble buildings with people with little glasses at the end of their nose checking you in and checking you out. That's sometimes where I work, but that's not what I mean by archives. So functionally, I think it would be nice to try to do more of this digitally. But again, it comes back to this earlier point, which is it would be nice if we could try to shift expectations and value this. And my sense, at least, is that the trend is in the opposite direction. So just a simple Chicago footnote gives you a little bit more space, and you're sort of in the mode of maybe just writing a sentence or two about what that scholar said, who you're going to say was wrong. And so my sense is that when you have that style of footnote, people are a little more inclined to just tell you a little bit about why they are citing what they're citing. And it takes you on that road towards more, whereas a kind of parenthetical citation, you can't be getting into that because you're in the two columns and, you know, this kind of thing. So I think it looks like we might agree on that. Yeah. Well, I was able to speak to your second question adequately? Oh, I see. Okay. Yes, I'm sorry. I did not answer that. I think there are a couple things. From the standpoint of the journal and reviewers, is this a burden for them that they also have to consider this? We talked at some length about that at dinner last night, and it could be. In this case, I think the journal thought that I should have to live and die by what fits in the word count, like everybody else. And then if I wanted to, after the fact, document things for posterity, they're happy to make space on the website for me to do so. But if we do have a system in which people are able to submit 20,000 word appendices with all this kind of exegesis, it might raise the quality of scholarship, but I think it's going to definitely affect publication and review. So as a kind of first step, I thought, you know, I've done all this thinking. I've since then forgot most of the reasons why I made the specific interpretive decisions because I've moved on. And to try to prevent that knowledge decay, I wanted to get it online. But if this had been on the front side, it would have taken me another year or two. It took me several years to write the article in the first place. It would have taken me even longer just to get it up to the position. You get into arms races and reviewers. Now we're reading 75 pages of stuff. It's just, I have to think a lot more about that. It's a good question. I don't know what to say.
Well, this is fantastic. I know there's more of you have questions, but unfortunately we need to end this session here. Let's give both our participants again a great round of applause.